Welcome to PLUSone, the monthly series where I take a look at the free PlayStation Plus games and help you decide if they're right for you. After all, the games may be free, but your time is valuable. Now, usually with PLUSone, I try to have these videos done within a few days of the free games going live, but this time around I was sick. Thankfully, September's free games are sick too, featuring Batman Arkham Knight and Darksiders 3. Both games are the third in their respective franchises. Both games made some rather divisive changes and additions to the previous game's formulas, and both games, in spite of these changes, are pretty damn good. But as the third game in a running series, are either a good choice for you to pick up and play? Let's find out today, and let's start with Batman. Released in June 2015, Arkham Knight is the third Batman game by developer Rocksteady and is currently the cap-off in the Arkham trilogy of games. Well, it's a bit more than a trilogy, with the prequel Arkham Origins and its spin-off Blackgate having been developed by other teams, but either way, new players are getting thrown into the end of a saga here. This means that yes, there is a spoiler warning for Arkham City and to a lesser extent Asylum, but both games are about a decade old, so consider yourself warned. Arkham Knight takes place about a year after the end of Arkham City, following Joker's death in that game's climax. Crime has dropped all throughout Gotham City, and in fact, the city's never been safer, even though Batman is sure something is coming. Lo and behold, on Halloween of all nights, the villain Scarecrow reveals a new fear toxin, an evil concoction that threatens the entire city. Practically overnight, the entire population of fake Chicago is evacuated, leaving only the Gotham Police Department, thousands of criminals that are running rampant throughout the city, and the Dark Knight himself. From here, Batman does his usual Batman things, trying to determine Scarecrow's location and the extent of his plans, dealing with his usual rogues gallery of foes in the form of side quests, beating up goons, driving a sick car, and occasionally fighting the mysterious Arkham Knight, a new villain that seems to know everything about our hero. One thing I really enjoy, even as somebody who played only a few hours of Asylum and absolutely none of City, is that this game doesn't badger you with unskippable tutorials. When Arkham Knight starts, with one exception, it doesn't stop, instead assuming that you know what you're doing and that you've played pretty much any game with third-person hand-to-hand combat from the last decade. There are still on-screen pop-ups, of course, and they'll gently nudge you towards mechanics either new to the game or new to the player. Tutorials are also still here optionally in the form of AR challenges. Completing these will give you bonus level up points to use as you expand Batman's abilities, but they're tucked away to the side if you need them instead of tossed in your face. It's refreshing to have a game that respects your intelligence and just lets you play the damn game, so bonus points to Rocksteady on this one. As I touched on a moment ago, combat in the Arkham games is something you've almost certainly experienced before, even if you've never played one of these games, because every game had this combat for a while. This is your typical third-person stand around and wait for enemies to attack you so you can counter them game, with some punching in between. Batman often gets the credit for this style's resurgence in recent years, but arguably Assassin's Creed did it first. Arkham just kind of did it better. Personally, I'm take it or leave it with this facet of gameplay. It's flashy, you feel badass while doing it, but if I want flashy, badass combat, I would rather play Yakuza or more recently Spider-Man's far more active take on this same style. As you defeat enemies, ideally with longer strings of combos, you'll earn experience that you can use to improve Batman's gear. From your usual damage reduction to a faster grapple boost when zipping through the skies of Gotham, the upgrades just add a great amount of progression here that more than makes up for the more standard gameplay. Of course, you wouldn't be the Batman without stealth, and sneaking around makes its return in Arkham Knight. I'll take this stealth gameplay over the combat any day, dropping down on entire crowds of baddies and reducing them to unconscious puddles of terrified pee. That's the kind of thing that this game totally shines at. Many of Batman's gadgets are naturally more geared towards silent takedowns anyway, and having the time to go through the somewhat clunky quick select feels far more natural when you're not being pressured for time like you would be in the combat. This is equally true for the detective sections of the game, where you'll use Batman's spidey sense to either find the objective you're looking for, or secrets such as this game's hundreds of Riddler trophies. It's true as well for traveling through Gotham on foot. I don't quite love how the Caped Crusader moves, but that could easily just be because I'm not experiencing this game as the culmination of a series as I probably should be, and I'm instead hopping into this one relatively fresh. But with that said, his arsenal of gadgets gives him so many amazing mobility options. It's beyond satisfying zipping onto a perch, flying over it, and gliding through the air at breakneck speeds. Speaking of mobility options, the one exception to the tutorials being optional comes in the form of the Batmobile, a new addition to Arkham Knight. This supercar slash battle tank will make up a good chunk of Knight's gameplay, sadly. For one, its handling in car mode is a little bit loose for my tastes, and speeding through Gotham in the Batmobile was the only time that the frame rates would totally collapse on me, which is never a good look, especially after several patches to improve these sorts of issues. Far more importantly, the Batmobile's combat sections just aren't fun. The pace screeches to a halt as you slowly wait for your tank gun to reload between shots while meandering between slow enemy tank shots, and while paying absolutely zero mind to the terrain around you as Bruce Wayne racks up a city damage bill that even he couldn't afford. Don't worry though, the tanks you destroy are all unmanned because Batman doesn't kill. Sure. Now, yes, you unlock more abilities for the Batmobile as the game progresses, but it doesn't do enough to convince me that this was the best way to implement such an awesome car. Usually, I'd rather just zipline and glide through the air instead of drive this thing. I don't know, it just doesn't stick, and that sucks because it's probably about a third of the game, if not more. I don't knock Rocksteady for trying though, they had to add something in to make Knight seem distinct from the other Arkham games and prevent fatigue. Anyway, with all of this in mind, the question here is Arkham Knight right for you, even if you haven't played the first two Arkham games? I'm gonna ignore the narrative for a second here and say that yes, mechanically, even in spite of these issues that I have, it's worth giving a +1 to your collection, and it's worth trying out even as your first Arkham game. The plot won't be nearly as meaningful without the context that Asylum and City provide though, so you'll just be playing a Batman game to play as Batman. I would say the best bet for newcomers here would be to try Arkham Knight, see how it feels, and then if you like it, pick up the Return to Arkham collection on PS4 and play those earlier games before coming back. Fair warning though, I've heard many rumblings about issues with the PS4 ports of Asylum and City, and I don't know that they've been fixed up like Knight's issues have. Arkham Knight will eat up 55 gigs of your hard drive space, and if you're a completionist, it'll eat up dozens of hours of your time, even if you use a guide for those hundreds of hidden Riddler secrets. With so much content packed in here, plus a ton of DLC if you want to spend a bit of cash, there's no question that Batman is a more than worthy addition to any PS4 owner's gallery of games. Speaking of hard drive space though, September's second free game will eat up a little bit less, although not much. Clocking in at just under 44 gigabytes is Darksiders 3, a game released only a year ago in November 2018. In fact, the entire Darksiders franchise has been free on PS Plus in some form, and this works out really well because it's also one of those franchises that's tough to justify buying right at launch. We'll touch on that in a little bit though. First, let's dive into this game. Darksiders throughout all three entries thus far has this really neat parallel narrative structure, with each game putting you in the shoes of a different one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. The lore is a bit confusing to lay out all at once without describing each game in a good amount of detail, but I'm gonna try and keep it short here. In Darksiders 1, you play as the horseman named War, who was held prisoner for 100 years after allegedly starting the apocalypse early. Oops. In Darksiders 2, you play as Death, who attempts to revive humanity after that apocalypse and prove his brother War's innocence. And that game takes place during the 100 years that War is captive. Darksiders 3 also takes place during this 100 years, and you play as Fury, the only female horseman, as you search for and recapture the 7 deadly sins. So far it's been this really cool narrative style as you piece together the events of the apocalypse from each horseman's perspective. The upcoming spin-off, Darksiders Genesis, will let you play both as War and as the final horseman, Strife, and after that we'll hopefully get the awesome conclusion featuring all four, probably called Darksiders 4 Horsemen or something. Anyway, I digress. How does Darksiders 3 play? It's Dark Souls. I don't mean that as some kind of joke either. The combat here has shifted from a heavy hack and slash style into a more methodical Souls-like approach, while still attempting to keep some hack and slashy bits to it. Darksiders has always had this weird space in gaming, starting as a half hack and slash, half Zelda-like with 1, then adding some random loot drops in 2 and expanding the world size even more, and now turning into a straight Souls-like with 3, before turning into more of a Diablo clone with Genesis. The key Souls-like elements here are a more limited checkpoint system, slower use of health items as you wait for the animation to finish, the inability to cancel an attack with a dodge, meaning you have to finish every attack in full, enemies that drop souls when defeated, the complete loss of all of your souls when you die, and the importance of that aforementioned dodge. It's this weird hybrid that attempts to have its cake and eat it too, which leads to some key problems in the pursuit of improvements. For example, one benefit to Darksiders 3's approach is that your dropped souls will never disappear even if you die 100 times before you can retrieve them. That's offset by the less soulsy level design, as there are generally far fewer shortcuts here. In something like Bloodborne, you can almost always find shortcuts after particularly challenging sections that will allow you to skip past them at your leisure, and there's pretty frequently one of these that leads you almost right to that area's boss. In Darksiders 3, well, first off, I didn't die, so I didn't really have to worry about this, but when you do die, you're taken back to the automatic checkpoints provided by these shops. But these can sometimes be a hike away from the boss room. There's nothing more frustrating than dying and having to retread the same steps over and over again just to get back to the boss that killed you and hope that you do better this time. This sort of stuff is exactly why I usually can't buy or play the Darksiders games at launch. The series often runs into huge, glaring performance issues and just flat-out oversights that thankfully get patched within a month or two of release. For example, Darksiders 3 patched in several new checkpoint locations not long after launch, fixed many of the game-breaking bugs that existed at launch along with hundreds of smaller issues, and even patched in a classic combat style to line up with the previous games. Classic mode allows you to cancel out of any attack with a dodge, and removes the need to wait for the healing animation to finish when you use a health item. While I didn't mind the default gameplay style, Classic just feels better overall for the kind of games that Darksiders have always been. And I for one applaud Gunfire Games for being willing to tweak their vision after criticism. These folks are clearly very dedicated to this franchise, and I enjoy these games more than enough to continue supporting them to the point that I own the other games 2 or 3 times each, but it's almost always safest to wait like 3 months and buy them then because these sorts of bugs and oversights are just too common with them. That makes it a perfect PS Plus kind of game though, so I'm not complaining too much. Even if you're not a fan of Souls-like gameplay, the Classic mode does do enough to bring it back into more traditional hack-and-slash form, so don't let that initial concern scare you away. If anything, the game's weakest point is its frame rate, because this game is just not very well optimized. I had the frame rate completely tanked several times just by walking into a new area, seemingly at loading zones. And while in combat it's usually a consistent 30 frames per second, if you use Fury's stronger Wrath attacks, or if too much is going on, it can dip here too. The lip-syncing animations for the in-game dialogue are also very possibly the stiffest I've ever seen in a game, and that is saying a lot. I found the combat engaging enough to help me look past these issues though, as the game is fairly responsive, really generous with enemy hit stun, and the combos, while they start simple, do develop after a little while past your basic square combos. I've also gotta say, I had a bit of a mental block with R1 as the dodge button. There's something I just couldn't get used to about playing a Souls-lite and having regular hack-and-slash square combos. It never got me killed or anything, but I did take a few hits because of this block. If this game had custom control options, you can bet I would have swapped right away. With all of this in mind, how does Darksiders 3 fare as a game for series newcomers? Thanks to that plot structure, I would say that surprisingly, it fares better than Batman does. Darksiders 3 is just as easy to dive into as 1 or 2 were, and I say that as somebody who started this franchise with 2. Since the plots are more or less self-contained, all you need is a passing understanding of light dungeon puzzles that take pretty clear inspiration from the Zelda series, and you have one of the better Zelda games not made by Nintendo. For the price of free, it's certainly worth a +1 to your collection. If you dig those first few hours of gameplay, you'll be in for about 10 more hours of fun from there, and up to maybe 30 hours total if you're going for every single trophy. If I'm gonna close out my thoughts on Darksiders with anything, it's this. These games are far more fun than their underlying issues let on. I may have a good amount to criticize here since these games love to change forms every entry, but Darksiders is one of, if not the strongest not Zelda series out there. If that sounds remotely appealing to you, I promise that it will almost certainly be worth the download. And that's it for September 2019's free games, folks. Which game are you going to try first? Let me know down in the comments below. As always, thank you very much for subscribing, and until the next video, stay golden.